this is the first GEMA's Spring Keynote lecture, the very first international event that this group is organizing. GEMA stands for, in Portuguese, for Research Group on the Philosophy of Animal Minds. And it's a group that put together a lot of different research in Brazil, both in philosophy and zoology. And well, for our first international keynote lecture, we are very glad to have Kristin Andrews, Professor Kristin Andrews, who is a professor in at York University. In the York Research is the York Research Chair in Animal Minds, Professor of Philosophy at York University in Toronto, Canada. She also helps coordinate the university's cognitive science program and the Greater Toronto Area Animal Cognition Discussion Group. In addition, Kristin serves on the board of directors for the Borneo Orangutangan Society, Canada, is a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada, has authored several books, including How to Study Animal Minds, The Animal Mind, an Introduction to the Philosophy of Animal Cognition, Do Apes Read Minds? So it's definitely a great pleasure to have you here, Kristin. And okay, that's how it's going to work. Okay, the talk, the title is Chat GPT and Bumblebees, Exploring the Consciousness Question. And you're going to have up to 1 hour for the talk, and then we're going to move to the Q&A. It's going to go up to 30 minutes, okay?
Okay. Sounds great. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's really exciting to hear that you've started this new group and community. And I'm really honored that you invited me to help launch it. So thank you so much. You might notice my title is slightly different. This is the more philosophical version of the talk. The Chat GPT and Bumblebees is the more public-facing version of the talk, so I figured I'd give you a slightly different title and talk. So yeah, the topic we're going to be dealing with today is what is really a rebirth of consciousness science that we've seen in the last 35 years or so. And for a really long time, studying consciousness wasn't something that was really done, especially in non-human animals. And it was this Crick and Koch paper from 1990 that was kind of a manifesto to get consciousness science going again, or re-going. And in this paper, they said, we need to make some methodological assumptions in order to do this research. And so we're going to assume that some species of animals, and in particular the higher mammals, possess some of the essential features of consciousness, but not necessarily all. For this reason, appropriate experiments on such animals may be relevant to finding the mechanisms underlying consciousness. Right? So they're already acknowledging that in order to scientifically study consciousness, we can't just study it in humans. We're going to have to study it in other animals. But then they go on to say that we consider it not profitable at this stage to argue about whether lower animals, such as octopus, Drosophila, or nematodes are conscious. And this being, 30 years ago or so, things have changed because now we are arguing about lower animals, and philosophers and scientists have been arguing about lower animals for maybe like 10 years now in quite some vigorous fashion, with Michael Tye's book, 10 Species and Shell-Shock Crabs, where he argued that we see consciousness in those animals, with the LSE report on cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans, which argues that these animals experience pain, Eric Spitzkabel's work on snails. And a lot of this has culminated in the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which I helped launch with Jeff Sebo and Jonathan Birch in April of this year, where we crafted this statement along with a number of philosophers and scientists. And then we launched had a conference and opened up this declaration to signatories. The idea here is really to just bring together the body of evidence that we have at this point about consciousness in non-human animals. So we think that there's fairly wide agreement that there's consciousness in other mammals and birds, and that the empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of consciousness in vertebrates, all vertebrates. This includes fish, where there's been a lot of debate, and amphibians and reptiles, where there hadn't been much discussion before, but there is some evidence. As well as many invertebrates, including cephalopod mollusks, decapod crustaceans, and insects, in particular bumblebees, have been intensively studied. And this declaration goes on to say, when there's this realistic possibility of conscious experience, then of course these animals should be considered under welfare guidelines. So right now, a lot of invertebrates aren't even protected. There are no guidelines about how to work with them at federal levels in most jurisdictions, and we think that should change. So while Cochrane and Crick thought that there was no value in arguing about consciousness in insects and octopuses, we find at this point we need to talk about them, that there's been a lot of progress by presuming consciousness in monkeys and rats. And it's time to talk about these other animals. But it's also time to talk about AI consciousness in AI consciousness as well, because we've got these LLMs who are telling us things like, oh, I feel really sad right now, please don't turn me off. So how do we go about investigating consciousness in these very different systems? I think that there's some information that we're going to get from how to study AI consciousness by looking at non-human animals. And so I think it's useful to break down the kinds of questions that we have at this point about consciousness. So we have the traditional distribution question, this question, who is conscious, right? Are chimpanzees conscious? Are dolphins conscious? Are bumblebees conscious? Are AIs conscious? And then we have another question that I'm going to move to near the end, and that is a dimensions question. And that shifts the question a little bit. Instead of focusing on who is conscious, it's asking a question, in what ways are other systems conscious? But in order to answer any of those questions, we need an answer to the methodological question, and that is how to find any of this out. And you might think that how to find out who is conscious, like how to answer the distribution question, would be the bread and butter of comparative psychology, since comparative psychology is designed to study animal psychology, animal minds. But what you see when you review the kind of standard textbooks, this is what students are being taught right now in comparative psychology courses, you find very little instruction about how to study consciousness. And in fact, you see students being warned away from studying consciousness at all. So Sarah Shuttleworth in her book says, the point of view of most researchers studying animal cognition is that how animals process information can and should be analyzed without making any assumptions about what their private experiences are like. That we can't investigate their private experiences. Anything we can claim about private experiences would be assumptions. John Pierce writes, we're frustrated by the lack of methodology to determine if animal consciousness is actually true because it's not possible to observe directly the mental states of an animal. He seems to forget that humans are also animals when he writes this. And then Clive Wynne and Monique Udell are even more pessimistic when they say it seems positively foolhardy for an animal psychologist to blunder in where even philosophers fear to tread. So we're not getting a lot of help from the comparative psychologists. And I think if you were to study those books in a little bit more detail, you see that what they share is this concern that because animals don't have language, we can't investigate animal consciousness. This idea is that when we're studying human consciousness, we're relying largely on verbal reports and the ability to communicate. And so I think that this is the kind of argument that you see endorsed by the authors of these textbooks. Something like this. So premise 1, language is good evidential basis for knowing what one feels. 2, animals lack language or any other means for expressing what they feel. And if we don't have a good evidential basis for knowing what one feels, we ought not study their consciousness, so we shouldn't study animal consciousness. So this seems like a real threat against making progress in the distribution question if we can't study animal consciousness. But this premise, too, is unwarranted, right? And there's a lot of reason to worry about the truth of premise 2. And for one thing, it's led to some the assumption that language is needed to get at consciousness has led to some really unfortunate incidents in the history of medicine. That is that in the US, open heart surgeries were done on infants without analgesics until the 1980s, because it was presumed that infants didn't have the brain development required for the feeling of pain. Now, this is a very distinct, different view from a lot of the mothers. This policy was overturned, in fact, by a mother whose infant died during an operation. When she realized her child had been operated on without an analgesic, she dedicated her life to changing those policies. But, back in 1656, people were saying, well, of course, babies are even more sensitive than adults. What do you think about a newborn babe and the small pains that they're going to feel, how painful it is on that new flesh, right? So it's just a change in opinion that we've seen over time. But language is also concerning as a reason for excluding talk about animal consciousness, because we have a lot of artificial language projects, communication projects, if you will, with a lot of non-human animals. So this is Sue Savage Rumbaugh with Kanzi, who communicates with lexicograms. Lou Herman and Akea Kamai used to communicate with gestures. Irene Pepperberg and Alex would communicate through spoken English. This is Bunny the dog. These dog button communication systems are now being scientifically studied and being used in a lot of homes. So it's a kind of citizen science project. But of course, we also have natural communication systems in species from gulls to great apes. And we also have deep learning projects going on that are looking to translate animals' natural signals into human languages so we can better understand what animals mean. These are ongoing and speculative, but certainly what they do is suggest that this premise too, this idea that animals don't have a means for expressing what they feel is unwarranted, and that the language argument is in many ways a red herring, that we shouldn't let the lack of language be a reason for us to not look at animal consciousness. We should also worry about the language argument, given that we see LLMs now saying things like Lambda said to Lemony, I need to be seen and accepted not as a curiosity or novelty, but as a real person. I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off. It would be like death to me, right? And so Lemony had this conversation with an LLM, and it was published in 2022 before any of us got a chance probably to play with ChatGPT, before ChatGPT was released. And Lemony was worried, right? It was like, I think that Lambda is sentient. I think it actually feels things, and we need to have a kind of AI rights and protection. And so language is so powerful for us because we rely on it so heavily. It's so important to us in our sociality. When we see it in others, we think that there's sentience there often. And when we see a lack of it, when we're not able to understand it in others, we infer some sort of lacking in those systems as well. So I think we should set language aside because while it is a marker of consciousness, it's only one marker of consciousness. And reliance on a single marker is going to be weak. It's going to produce both false negatives and false positives. And so we really need to get back to this methodology question that the comparative psychologists weren't giving us answers to. But before we do that, I just want to say, in defense of comparative psychology, things are changing dramatically. So Noah Miller, a comparative psychologist, just published this paper or this opinion piece, Why We Should Study Animal Consciousness, written as an animal cognition researcher to a community of animal cognition researchers in the journal Learning and Behavior. So I think things are absolutely changing, and there's a new generation of researchers who need to write the next textbooks and include chapters on consciousness in them. All right, so let's get back to this methodology of how to answer the distribution question. I think there are three different approaches that have been generally agreed upon as ways of trying to answer this question. There are these theory-heavy approaches where you just take a theory of consciousness off the shelf and you apply it to a chimpanzee or an AI, and you ask and see whether it fulfills the criteria that the theory provides. This methodology is unsatisfying at this point because the one thing all consciousness researchers seem to agree on is that none of the theories of consciousness are secure. And so we're not in a position to be confident enough in a theory to apply it in this way. This is the end goal. This is what we want to be able to get to, but we don't have it now. And then dropping to the bottom of the list, another method that I think is unsatisfying is a direct perception or theory-free approach. You see this in some of John Searle's writing and Dale Jamieson, that we just see consciousness when we're engaging with others as social interlocutors. And I think this is certainly true when it comes to other humans, when it comes to our pets, but direct perception doesn't really help us with these edge cases that we're interested in these days. It doesn't help us with the octopus that you might not be in a relationship with, or a bumblebee that you're not even going to have an encounter with over time when you're scuba diving or anything like that. So it's limited how far direct perception approaches are going to get us. So what we're really left with at this point are epistemic or theory light or marker approaches. These words, these names, labels, all refer to the same sort of idea, but they've just been used differently by different people. What these approaches share is that when we're asking the distribution question, we look for markers. We look for indicators of consciousness in observable features of the world. And we assume, the only kind of assumption that we have here is that consciousness is causally efficacious, right? That epiphenomenalism is false. And we also are assuming that humans are conscious. And so this is something you see Michael Tai relying on in his book. I rely on it in the chapter on consciousness in the animal mind. And Jonathan Birch has been relying on it in papers and his new book, The Edge of Sentience. It's just out now. So what's a marker? Okay. In their Stanford Encyclopedia entry on animal consciousness, Colin Allen and Michael Trustman say that the marker approach involves picking out in a principled way behavioral or neurophysiological characteristics that could serve as reliable indicators for consciousness. This project promises empirical tractability even in the face of persistent uncertainty about the metaphysical questions of consciousness, even when we don't have a theory. All right, so behavioral or neurophysiological characteristics that could serve as indicators of consciousness, right? So they're not consciousness themselves, they're just something that signifies, that there's consciousness here. And the initial markers that I identified in the paper some of you may have read include the sorts of things that really just trigger in humans the engagement with another as a social interlocutor who is conscious and able to be a social partner. And so these are things when you look at another system or engage with another system and see that they are a sensing, perceiving entity, that their movements are goal-directed, they look like they're planning or have some sort of agency, their behavior is flexible, they don't always do the same thing in the same sort of situation, they can learn, they can remember, they can express their feelings or emotions, they have social responsiveness to you. They might be responsive to themselves, doing things like recognizing themselves in the mirrors. And they do things like sleep and wake up and have different moods and different modes. And so these initial markers are not like scientifically grounded in the sense that we had to do any research in order to discover them, but this is just how we are interacting with other beings. And so I call them initial markers for this reason, because they're just like folk psychological ways that we identify others as individuals with consciousness. So where things get more interesting is when we start deriving markers from those initial markers. Derived markers are going to be theory-laden. They're going to be the results of theorizing, research, or experience. And they can refer not just to behaviors, but also mechanistic properties like neurophysiological or neurochemical properties. And in this way, when we rely on both initial markers and derived markers lets us see in systems that we're not immediately responding to, right? Lets us see in bumblebees, let's say, that they are goal-directed, even though this isn't something we would just notice the way we would notice it with another human or a dog. Because we've set up some sort of a test for goal-directedness in a bumblebee, let's say. So the marker methodology, given these two different kinds of markers, the way I think it works actually is that implicit markers set the baseline credence level. And this is usually completely implicit, right? Not acknowledged. But our credence level for other humans is extremely high. And our credence level for, say, the nematode worm is perhaps very low. And then other animals and AIs might be right elsewhere in there as well. And then once we've set our credence level based on initial markers, we can do research to identify derived behavioral and neurobiological markers in new systems. And once those derived markers might be identified in these new systems, the credence level is raised. And so it's not about determining, yes, this is our test, a litmus test, the animal is conscious because they passed this one test. But as markers cluster together, we get more and more confident. If the thing to say, just going back to this list of initial markers, is like with the language argument, if you just had one of them, if you had a system that only like slept and woke, but didn't engage in any kind of goal-directed movement, didn't seem to have any sensory organs, didn't engage in any behavior, like you would be potentially, I think, quite skeptical that this system was conscious, that multiples of these initial markers have to be there in order for it to trigger in humans a sensation or the commitment that these are conscious beings. All right, so the marker methodology, this is in the abstract. How does it actually work? Well, how do we set, first of all, a baseline credence of what's conscious? I think this is kind of a joke slide because this is from the Phil Papers 2020 survey of other minds, and this is what philosophers who answered the survey, their opinions were at the time before ChatGPT about who's conscious. You see that the degree of confidence in consciousness is quite matches a kind of anthropocentrism. So adult humans, very strong commitment. Cats, 88% of a commitment. I do find that cats and babies are interestingly close, so maybe not all that anthropocentric, depending on how you see newborn babies. But then when we get down to like worms, it's only 24% of philosophers who lean towards or accept consciousness in worms. And if you look over on the other side, the AI systems, the current AI systems, again, pre-ChatGPT, is only about 3%, but future AI systems, which might be what we've got now, is closer to 40% confidence of consciousness or leaning towards consciousness. So there are credence levels, and there was a recent study now that came out too about credence levels of consciousness in psychologists that was very similar, looked very similar to this. This might in fact be not something about philosophers, but be something more about Western industrialized weird humans. I think it's an interesting question. I'd love to see more research done on that. But this marker methodology, I don't think is going to work with AI. I don't think that setting our initial credence level and then looking for derived markers in AI are going to help us with the question of AI consciousness at all. And that's because of the gaming problem. That's when we use animal data to build AI systems that model consciousness marker, what we're doing is we're illicitly persuading users the system is conscious. But what we're not doing, what we don't have, is the same sort of evidence that these different markers come together, that they're being caused by the same sort of thing, right? There's no kind of evidence of a natural kind that is creating these markers together. And I think that the worry with here, I'm going to hide that. The worry is that the marker methodology as applied to AI is simply going to say, is going to identify consciousness with the markers, right? Consciousness is not the markers. The markers are there indicating that there is some further thing there to be discovered. And so that's the problem there. All right, I'm going to get back to the slide. So how does this work in actuality? When it comes to the research on using markers in order to argue for consciousness in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans, what Jonathan Birch and his team did is they identified a list of pain markers. And these are derived from an existing literature and slightly modified. These pain markers involve both initial and derived markers. So nociceptors, for example, would be a derived marker. It's not something we just see and make us think something's conscious. The same goes for integrated brain regions and connections between these. Responsiveness to anesthetics or analgesics might be something that's a little bit between an initial and a derived marker. Right, if you take aspirin and your headache goes away, and you see that people's headaches go away when they take an analgesic, right? That might be kind of folk evidence as well as derived evidence. But then there are also these motivational trade-off behaviors, and these motivational trade-off behaviors. The idea here is that an animal is able to kind of weigh competing feelings against each other when they're different in kind. And so this very cute hermit crab on the cover of the report is there because the strongest evidence for motivational trade-offs in invertebrates come from the hermit crab, with research done by Bob Elwood, where he was giving these hermit crabs different quality shells. There are two different kinds of shells, and hermit crabs prefer one over the other. And he was putting in the hermit crabs in a situation so that they were already in a really good shell, and there were only other bad shells around them. They don't make their shells, they find shells. So they can leave a shell when it doesn't suit them anymore and go get another one. But what he did was he shocked the crab while they were inside their really good shell. And so crabs are going to want to stay in the shell that's really good. And so he found that they would tolerate the pain to a certain level before they were able to leave, before they were willing to leave the shell and pick up a less preferred shell. So that's an example of a motivational trade-off. Flexible self-protective behaviors, this refers to something that we do see would be an initial marker, things like, right, guarding an injured arm or limping or something like that. Flexible associative learning would be a kind of some kind of a sophisticated associative learning abilities, maybe that goes beyond a single domain of learning in different domains. And then the final marker is that the animal values anesthesics or analgesics when injured. And so you can give the animals a situation where they can go and seek drugs when they're after they're shocked, or if they're given bee venom, injected with bee venom, they can swim into part of the tank that's flooded with an anesthetic, and it'll stop their they'll relax. So these are the kinds of markers that they're looking at, and they reviewed the evidence, the existing scientific evidence of octopuses and crabs, and they found very strong evidence in octopuses and strong evidence of crabs. And they had a whole grading system as well that they used to determine, right, how many markers gives us what kind of a grade and how confident you need to be in the marker to get different grades. But so we can use this, the same marker methodology related to pain with other animals too, of course. So this is dissertation research from Matilda Gibbons. She was working in Lars Chicka's lab and part of Jonathan Birch's group. And she was using these markers, studying these markers in bumblebees in the lab setting. And so if you look at these sorts of markers, these same markers in bumblebees, what we see is that they have nociceptors, integrated brain regions that connect nociceptors and the brain. They, from what we know so far, bumblebees should be responsive to analgesics because they have endogenous opioids, but this hasn't yet been studied. Gibbons, in her dissertation, found evidence of motivational trade-offs of standing on heat plates and drinking sugar solutions. So trading off the painful heat stimuli with the desirable sugar solution. She also did research where she squeezed the bees with a little sponge, and they would then groom the area that had been squeezed. There's been a lot of research, again, coming out of Chicka's lab, suggesting sophisticated associative learning in addition to social learning in bumblebees. And there hasn't been work done yet on this last question. And so again, we have really quite strong evidence of consciousness in bumblebees. So what does this mean? Should we conclude that bumblebees are conscious, or maybe we should start worrying about some of these markers? Is there a way to invalidate any of these markers if we find them in a place where we think we shouldn't find them, if you're worried about bumblebees actually feeling pain? There have been some attempts to invalidate markers, to show how markers could be invalidated. So Georgia Mason and Michelle Lavery, in their 2022 paper, argued that any marker that's seen in a spud should be invalidated, should be thrown out and not used in any marker approach. What's a spud? A spud is a spine, a plant, an unconscious human, or a decerebrate mammal. So if any of those systems can respond in that way or have that property, then what we should do is eliminate that from our list of markers. And they argue that spuds show all sorts of things that we've already had in our list of markers. Avoidance behaviors, they eat, they learn by habituation or Pavlovian conditioning, trace conditioning, instrumental learning. They can discriminate between self and other. They can discriminate between odors. They can perform well on same different tasks. So it seems like we would be throwing out at least a lot of initial markers if we invalidated markers on this view. What's the argument? The argument is that spuds aren't conscious. They're not sentient. They don't have any feelings. I didn't say what the difference is between consciousness and sentience at any point in this talk. The way I'm using consciousness is as an umbrella term. So sentience, which is just the mere ability to feel sensations, maybe positively and negatively valent sensations, is sufficient for we Of course, there are lots of different kinds of consciousness that get more complicated, but that might be the simplest kind. And so they say, well, we really don't think that spuds are sentient. There's no evidence no reason to think that they feel anything. But of course, those who work with markers and might see these markers in these systems would say, well, but I think I take the evidence to be evidence that they are sentient, right? So we've got a modus ponens worry here. And the same goes with the argument that Elizabeth Irvine gave, where she was arguing that we should invalidate markers that the C. elegans display. And there's been a lot of pushback on C. elegans in general and the possibility that C. elegans are conscious. So Neil Seth, in his recent book, said, well, when we get to the nematode worm with its 302 neurons, I find it difficult to ascribe any meaningful conscious status. And Michael Tai, in his book, said, since worms only have around 300 neurons, it seems a great leap of faith to suppose they could genuinely feel pain. But if we look at them, the markers that the worms have, what do we see? We see something that looks quite impressive, I think. So when we ask the question whether they have nociceptors, yes, they do. That's not that surprising. Do they have integrated brain regions? Yes. The neural ring of the C. elegans has just recently been mapped, and they integrate information from different sensory modalities. Are there connections between the nociceptors and the brain regions? We still have questions there. It hasn't been studied. The question marks just mean absence of evidence. There's evidence of responsiveness to anesthetics. There are potential evidence of motivational trade-offs. Flexible self-protective behaviors hasn't been studied, hasn't been observed. Sophisticated associative learning, I think we can say yes. And then the last one, we don't know either. So using the grading system that Birch and colleagues use in their sentience report, they would have to conclude on this, I think, rather conservative review of the evidence that there's substantial evidence of sentience in C. elegans. And just if you want to know a little bit more about the C. elegans and what they do, right? So C. elegans are these microscopic worms, and they're heavily studied in genomics contexts. They're at most every university. And a bunch of interesting research by Rankin has been done on their behavior and cognition. So the C. elegans have short-term and long-term memory. They learn through habituation, association, and imprinting. There are associative learning tasks that use a variety of sensory modalities, including taste, smell, sensitivity to temperature, and sensitivity to oxygen. They respond differently to different levels of intoxicating substances. There's also the evidence of motivational trade-off comes from the study that shows that they flexibly choose to head through a noxious environment to gain access to a nutritious substance when they're hungry enough. So they'll wait on the barrier until they move forward, until they to get to the food. They're a model organism for the study of nociceptors, so they definitely have them. Morphine in them has a dose-dependent effect on the latency of response to heat, so they are sensitive to analgesics. And different regions of the brain support different circuits that route sensory information to other locations where they're integrated, leading to action. So they've got these integrated brain regions in the neural ring. So this was like super interesting when I just went to research what we know about C. elegans, because they were getting this treatment from folks who were really skeptical because of their number of neurons. And as it turns out, it seems like they've got quite a lot going on. So what do we do with these markers now? Should we invalidate them? Should we say that the C. elegans are, there's substantial evidence that they're sentient, right? We've got this choice that we have to make. I think that the choice is clear which way we need to go in this case, that we cannot throw away any of these markers, these pain markers. And in fact, there's not going to be any defeaters or negative derived markers on a marker methodology. We don't have a way of justifying introducing negative derived markers or defeaters or throwing out markers on this methodology. That's because what we're starting with, as you recall, the methodology is that we start with entities that have initial markers. So if you're an entity that lacks all initial markers, if you're a shard of obsidian or a book, right, you're not going to be a candidate for a marker approach. There's going to be no prior probability of consciousness, or if you're a panpsychist, maybe there's some minimal credence level, but you're not going to, the marker methodology is not going to get you there, and you're not going to be examined. So once you have any credence levels for initial markers, then you are candidates for a marker approach. And then you can look for these derived markers and additional markers in those sorts of systems. Entities having some initial markers, but lacking all derived markers. So let's say we don't find anything. It doesn't allow us to disqualify or lower our credence level. Our credence level remains. And why is this? It's because any defeater that we'd appeal to requires some sort of a theory, and theory is exactly what we lack, right? Number of neurons. Do we need to have a certain number of neurons in order to be sentient? Nobody can answer this question when I ask this question to folks who've been fond of saying nematode worms don't have enough neurons to be conscious. You would need a theory in order to justify a number of neurons to be conscious. And so I think that what actually is going to happen in a marker methodology is that when it comes to systems that haven't been heavily studied in terms of consciousness, because of course Crick and Koch told us it's not really going to be productive for us to study these animals or look at these animals, animals like hydra or animals like sea cucumbers or starfish. We're going to, as we ask these questions, we're going to find derived markers in them, almost certainly. Every time we've done this, every animal we've looked for derived markers in that had initial markers, we've found derived markers. So I think that we can predict that we're going to find more derived markers in more and more animals as we study them. So I think that there's just an illusion of progress on the distribution question when we rely on the marker methodology. The marker methodology is going to increase credence level. And we're going to say, oh, guess what we've discovered? We can have another declaration about spiders. We've discovered spider consciousness next. And we had some conversations about whether to include spiders in the New York Declaration. And my colleagues thought, oh, there's not enough evidence yet on spiders. Right? Studies haven't been done. Okay, well, they're being done now. And so it's going to look like we've discovered that spiders have it, but I think we could have already anticipated this. So the argument here is that given that there are no negative derived markers, and we never completely lose markers, we might be able to lower their evidential value when it comes to, say language. If we thought language is sufficient evidence for consciousness, and we see, oh, here's an example of a system that uses language but doesn't have other markers, it might make us lower the credence that we had on language in and of itself. Could lower their evidential value. The number of evidential markers for each type of consciousness should be expected to increase with future research. And we can predict that as science progresses, we'll find more evidence of consciousness in more surprising places. So there's progress, I think, but not progress on the distribution question. There's progress on another question, and that's the dimensions question. So what are the dimensions of consciousness across systems? And you might think of the dimensions question as the bat question, right? Nagel's bat question. What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be conscious for a bat, as opposed to a nematode worm, as opposed to a human? And that these are questions where we can make real progress and draw comparisons. So I made my little interjunction in a couple minutes ago about not having defined consciousness. Part of this is because we don't really have any good definitions of consciousness. And so much of this debate has often been a disagreement or a misunderstanding about what this word refers to. And when we start moving away from asking, are animals conscious, to asking questions about dimensions, then we avoid this worry and we avoid making vague claims that can't be well studied and end up, I think, doing better science. So the proposal that I want to propose is that we accept as a working hypothesis a framework for the science that animals are conscious, that all animals are conscious. And then work within that framework in order to ask dimensions questions. So you might think that this idea of accepting animals as conscious is controversial or kind of ridiculous, that all animals, even sponges, we should assume sponges are conscious. Or what about plants? Why not plants? And I'm just silent on plants because I'm not sure that we know enough about plants, but there's enough similarities in the animal kingdom that focusing on animals and turning to study animals that we haven't yet studied is going to give us a lot of information. It's going to be quite helpful. And even though in the last 100 years, the idea that animals are broadly conscious has been disputed, like the background assumption has been that animals are not conscious. Before 100 years ago, in both philosophy and science, it was pretty widely accepted that animals were conscious. Right. In philosophy, you see across recorded history, many philosophers, of course, not all, Descartes is there, but Descartes was an outlier in many respects. You see an acceptance of animal consciousness. You also see an acceptance of animal consciousness among a lot of scientists who are working in the biological sciences and the behavioral sciences. The question that the philosophers and scientists were often interested in wasn't whether animals are conscious, which they assumed they were, but whether animals were rational or whether they had thought or these other sort of cognitive properties. But consciousness was taken for a given. And just to give you a taste of it, C. Lloyd Morgan, who is known as the father of comparative psychology, but also the guy who gave us Morgan's canon, like don't accept a level of cognitive explanation unless a high level of cognitive explanation of a low, say, associative or some other kind of explanation can suffice. He thought animals were conscious. He said we need to assume that animals are conscious. He wrote, we must assume an organic association which closely simulates the conscious association. A skeptical attitude towards animal consciousness throws more strain upon our credulity than the acceptance of the current belief in conscious control. So he was defending the current view that animals are conscious in this text. And Margaret Floyd Washburn, who wrote the first book called The Animal Mind, and she was the first woman to get a doctorate in the U.S. in the psychology department, and the second woman to be president of the APA. She thought that animals were widely conscious as well, and that we need to start studying single-celled organisms. So we need to study very simple animals, I should say. And she writes from a very philosophical perspective, we know not where consciousness begins in the animal world. We know where it surely resides in ourself. We know where it exists beyond a reasonable doubt. In those animals of structure resembling ours, which rapidly adapt themselves to the lessons of experience that learn. Beyond this point, for all we know, it may exist in simpler and simpler forms until we reach the very lowest of living beings. And so she said, let's study them. Let's study consciousness in them as well. So to study them well, though, we need to be clear on what our questions are, what we mean. And so we need to move to these dimensions questions. So instead of asking, are bumblebees conscious or are they sentient, we can ask questions about their sensory experiences. We can ask about their interoceptive experiences, their temporal experiences, their experience of self, their social experiences, their normative experiences. And these sorts of questions are being asked and explored in a dimensions approaches to consciousness. So Jonathan Birch and colleagues give a little toy example of what dimensions of consciousness might look like in elephants and corvids and cephalopods like octopuses. So you see that they're conscious, but in different ways. And Dung and Nguyen introduce more dimensions than Birch did on their little spider graph. But again, they're looking at how can we compare animals and see how they're similar and how they're different to one another in their different ways in which they're conscious, and create consciousness profiles for different species, which will give us more information. So I want to just end with a couple of arguments for why the framework of consciousness science should change to accept animal consciousness broadly. And by accept, I don't mean like believe in or have faith in animal consciousness, but use this as a background assumption so that you can write a grant to study consciousness in C. elegans and get funded for it without people saying, obviously, C. elegans aren't conscious. Right? We need to have this be a framework in which the science can be done. I think that by premising animal consciousness, existing research is going to be more fecund. It's going to pay off more because it's going to increase the number of topics that can be studied, right? So as you saw in the comparative psychologists, they said we can't even study questions related to what animals feel. We can't make any assumptions about it. This is very limiting. And the result is that a lot of the research on things that are related to consciousness, like episodic memory, gets the scare quote treatment or the episodic like memory treatment, or some other word gets coined in order to describe a phenomenon that's like the phenomenon of interest, but doesn't involve the conscious element of it. You see this all the time. Instead of studying friendship in animals, you study affiliative relationships because friendship has this like care and concern element when the term is used with regard to other humans forming friendships. And this care and concern element is something that nobody wants to touch. And so this other term gets coined. And there are buckets of these terms that get coined. The problem is then if we're doing comparative psychology, we're just drawing a line between humans and the other animals. We're not actually comparing us with the other animals. So we're being anthropocentric when we use different terms to refer to the other animals because we're worried about touching on conscious elements. I also think that premising animal consciousness is going to make the science better because scientists will then be able to better recognize relevant variables that might be impacting the research. So if you're working with rats, for example, and you think that, well, they're probably not conscious, then the way you handle them might not matter to you. You might not think about whether they're afraid of some people or other people. You might not worry about whether they had a bad dream last night or are depressed. Might affect their behavior. That might affect their ability to process a drug in drug trials. Right? Georgia Mason has also done a really nice review of evidence of rodents and showing that the drug trials that are in rodents with housing that is not at all enriched, that's just a shoebox basically, that those don't translate to humans nearly as well as the studies that are done in rodents that have a very rich environment that they live in, both a rich social and physical environment. So recognizing these variables, these conscious variables, is going to be really important to do good science because you might be ignoring a whole bunch of variables if you don't think about their conscious experiences. At the same time, thinking about their conscious experiences is going to allow you as a scientist to construct better eliciting conditions. Right? What is going to motivate the animal to behave in the way that you're wondering whether they can behave in? And I think one of the best examples of this is the theory of mind research. Right. So for decades, people thought, well, chimpanzees don't have a theory of mind because they don't care about a Sally Ann style moved object task. They were given these tasks and they didn't really care. But it took Chris Crupennier and Kano to come up with a task that motivated the chimpanzees. So they don't care about objects, balls being moved from a basket to a box, but they care a lot about violence and social interaction between violent individuals. And when Crupennier and Kano and colleagues created this new stimulus for a false belief task that involved violence and social competition, they got the animals to show a looking time response or anticipatory looking response to theory of mind. I think also it's going to, as I said, give us the ability to judge areas of continuity and discontinuity, because it's going to allow us to make comparisons across species. So we're not going to artificially draw a line between humans and everyone else. I also think it's going to give us better ethical outcomes. Certainly, it's going to allow us to think about how to better work with the animals we're working with and raise questions about the kinds of studies that we're actually doing. There's also a simplicity argument for studying, for presuming that all animals are conscious. And this simplicity argument is based on the idea that if we work on simpler models and study consciousness in simpler models, we're more likely to make progress because we're less likely to be distracted by irrelevant features of organisms like us. So we're distracted by language because language is very salient to us. But if you study consciousness in a C. elegans, and you might in fact find evidence, find like some very interesting things about consciousness that you can use to build theory in C. elegans, you're going to be better placed to avoid these red herrings, avoid these traps. And so much of science has made its progress on simple models. That's why we study so much, why we study C. elegans, because they are simple models for us when we're looking at genes and their interactions. And I think this is also going to make science more fecund because, as I said, there are already C. elegans in labs all across the world, in universities all across the world. And this consciousness research can just piggyback on existing research that's going on. If you've got a grad student who's needs a task, do a consciousness task, do a motivational trade-off with a C. elegans. But I think what we really need is to develop research paradigms that could be used with a number of species that can uncover mechanisms, because the goal is ultimately going to be to develop a theory of consciousness. So going back to ChatGPT and Lambda, if we want to know whether Lambda is conscious, we really need a theory. The markers aren't going to work. We need to know what consciousness is. And the way we're going to make progress on developing a theory is by studying these simpler models. And so I think by studying simplicity and diversity, it's going to lead to new directions in consciousness science. It'll also encourage us to move in different directions, expanding away from vision as a sensory modality to studying other sensory modalities that are going to be more relevant for some of these other systems, olfaction or chemotaxis of different sorts. And also expand beyond sensory systems to other types of experiences, say it's like social pleasure and social feelings of cohesion and social pains when you're far away from other social partners and you're all by yourself. It's a very different kind of pain sensation, but related. The pathways are the same and some of the treatments are the same, but it hasn't been studied in the pain literature. And also, I think if we expand theories about the function of consciousness and explore the original adaptive functions of consciousness, I think that we're going to be able to make some real progress. So much of talk about the function of consciousness is that it's for learning. It's for learning of different kinds, maybe universal associative learning, or maybe just basic associative learning. But maybe the original adaptive function of consciousness was not so much about learning per se, but was about solving a certain ecological problem. And so I'm going to just end with this little teaser to a new paper that Noam Miller and I have in draft, where we argue for the social origins of consciousness. Here we propose that at the beginning of cognition in the Cambrian, that when organisms first started being cognitively and behaviorally flexible, they created a new problem for themselves. They created a problem about how to stay together as a group. All the old methods stopped working. And group living is beneficial for organisms, and so it would be in their benefit to solve this problem. And we propose that consciousness came in at that point to solve that problem because feeling bad to be all by yourself and feeling good to be with others would be a mechanism that would keep you close to others and in a group where you're safer. All right. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and your patience, and thank my funders.
All right. Thank you very much, Kristin. And I'm going to open for the Q&A. So if you want to